Great. Okay, so I was thinking about the passion around data science and the idea that as a data science community, the desire is to really be able to leverage the rich, the deep, the broad, the big data in order to advance, the scientific and societal problems that we have. And similarly, I come from a team science perspective, and my passion there is to say, how can we leverage the teams that we have? How can we make the process, the support, the way we structure our work, you really leverage that and optimize it so that we can be advancing things more quickly. And so from that perspective, I'm going to talk a little bit about team science issues, sort of building off of what Alex just presented. And I'm going to start with an example from basketball. And so Shane Battier, he was a player that when folks looked at his all-star type of stats, the kind of traditional stats like rebounds and points scored and so forth, he did not appear to be an all-star player. But what they found was that when he was on the court, his team performed better and the other team performed worse. And that was a hugely valuable asset for the team. And so when they started doing more analysis and thinking about this issue more deeply, it really brought up the tension between, performing in ways that are in the interest of the team versus the interest of the individual. And, the ability to have contracts and incentives that are formulated around really getting the players, in this case, to do the kinds of things that are needed to have the team win. And so by doing more analysis around how the teams were playing and how the individuals on the teams were functioning, they started to change the way in which they were contracting their players and rewarding them. And this came from the original example from baseball. There was a movie that was developed from this where they were using analysis and perhaps all of you are familiar with.
Kara, I apologize for interrupting, but we're still seeing your first slide. So I don't know if you are meaning to advance to the slide deck.
Yeah, okay, let's see.
And I apologize for interrupting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wonder.
So we're now in the presentation mode, so maybe try advancing. Yes, we're now seeing the slide about the basketball story that you were just telling.
I'm sorry. So there must have been some kind of delay. Please let me know if you don't see it advancing, because I was seeing the right screen. So okay, so now moving. Here's Brad Pitt and the Moneyball. The idea really was saying, okay, well, how can we take a small team where we don't have as many resources as something like the Yankees, and do a better job to utilize our limited resources. And what they found was that there were some statistics, for instance, and some characteristics of the way in which the players were playing that were undervalued, and others that perhaps were overvalued. And so one thing that I like about this sort of overall example is something that was pointed out back to the Battier example, and is really trying to find things that previously were not really perceptible, so to speak, that people weren't really noticing or realizing that some of the ways in which Battier was playing on the team was actually yielding important outcomes. And so this, to me, is lending itself. It's the analogy here is to science teams, right? How do we think about what are the things that we're needing to do on teams? What are the things that we're needing to do to advance our science in ways that maybe we weren't doing before, and at least not attending to now? And so there's an opportunity for us to be thinking about how to employ science. And I would say that we really could benefit from the computational modeling and data science skills that all of you are championing to come to bear on this challenge. And so my particular interest is around transdisciplinary science. And this is, I was thinking maybe I could draw on Matthew's example of bias to sort of illuminate the difference here. We might think about if Matthew had contributed to a paper where he wrote a paragraph around, or a section of the paper around, bias integral to the data in AI applications. And, that paper had his perspective in it, but not necessarily really integrated. Another example might be in the interdisciplinary paradigm that Matthew Cubs sits at that table, introduces the idea of the bias into the conversation around developing a new system, and that results in some changes on how they deal with the historical data and the bias, and informs the systems. From a transdisciplinary perspective, perhaps Matthew comes and participates in a project to try to develop a new system, and through that introduces the idea of the historical, the bias from the historical data, as well as the latent bias, and those become core to a new model for developing a system or an approach that integrates the bioethics issues into the way in which the modeling takes place in a highly synthetic way. And that would be more on the sort of transdisciplinary paradigm. And when we talk to our transdisciplinary scientists, those who we fund to work in these large transdisciplinary initiatives, what we find is that they really, not having been trained and not having been doing this kind of research through their career, that they were really challenged to figure out, how do we actually change the way in which we're engaging and doing our science to get to that more synthetic process. They felt like it stretched their capacity. Yet they felt like this more complex work was leading them to solutions that were more robust and holistic than they had been previously doing. This introduced ideas of differences in values and languages that are challenged. So earlier today, we heard from our Microsoft colleague who said, it's challenging for the machine to deal with the fact that we talk about different terms in different articles to mean the same thing. And that kind of thing happens when we're talking to our colleagues around the table, which can introduce confusions and lead us into perhaps disagreements or thinking we're heading in the right direction when we each have a different mental model of what's happening. And so all of these are things that need to be understood and taken into account when we're thinking about how are we preparing our workforce into moving to a more team science and integrated approach to doing our work. And our incentives and recognition system, I think, is a really critical piece of this puzzle, and I'll touch on that in a minute. And so I helped to launch this field in 2006. We had a conference at NCI around transdisciplinary, understanding the value of transdisciplinary science, and that is where we coined the phrase, the science of team science, and that led to this special issue in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And I had the honor of being on a National Academies committee where we developed the report, Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. We've had an annual conference and so forth. So there's been a lot of effort. There's a lot of work still to be done, and I'm just going to share a little snapshot to make a few points in the short amount of time that I have. So this study, myself and colleagues did, where we looked at our transdisciplinary tobacco use research centers and compared their productivity to some matched RO1 samples to try to say, well, how is the productivity of these different ways of funding our science, different, and is there a value add, for instance, in our transdisciplinary research? And what we see is that over a 10-year period of time, there's an initial lag in the productivity for our transdisciplinary initiatives, where they're really working to get the collaborations going and the infrastructure and the institutional support for doing this kind of integrated work and so forth going. But once they get going, they excel in their level of productivity. Cummings and Kiesler looked at similar kinds of things from a couple different angles. One of the things they did is instead of looking over time on these graphs, you see they looked at as you increase the number of investigators and the number of disciplines, how is the productivity looking then? And what they found was that there's somewhat of a degradation of effect as you increase the number of disciplines. And similarly, as you increase the number of institutions, we also see somewhat of a degradation of effect for productivity. And so the question is, well, why is this happening? I would argue that, that adding these kinds of complexities may be critical and important to advancing the science. And what seems to be one of the cases is that key things like coordination mechanisms and the kind of skills and processes that go along with it were key to this. Were key differences in the success. So the projects that use more coordination mechanisms had more successful outcomes. But interestingly, the greater number of the universities involved, the fewer the coordination mechanisms that were used and the fewer the project outcomes. So this just is a way to highlight how these things are become a really critical and important thing to attend to, not only in our budgets. Usually that's the first thing that gets cut when our large projects face budget cuts. We cut the things like coordination and the skills to make sure that these things are done smoothly and fluidly. And so when we think about the kinds of skills that are involved, this is just a little sampling of the kinds of things we might think about that are maybe above and beyond our sort of typical thinking of, what are we going to need to be doing to get this project moving forward, developing a shared vision, facilitating the development of conceptual models and so forth. And Alex brought up the challenge of having diverse goals. How do you bring your team along, attending to the different goals and the different needs that people have, particularly in the context of career. And that brings us back to tenure and promotion. In order for our initiatives, particularly these highly integrative and large teams, complex initiatives, the more we need to be devoting time to the kinds of skills and activities that were on the previous slide. Yet our tenure and promotion policies, I did an analysis of a few hundred universities' tenure and promotion policies to look at team science and interdisciplinarity. And what we see is that they're really, the core things are independence, reputation, and leadership. Yet there's little room for incorporating right now in many of the policies the kinds of team science issues. And even when they do that, they're often doing it in a cursory or conflicting way, right? So you need to be clearly establishing your independence within the context of a team and trying to navigate how to do those things. Sort of brings us back to the Battier example, where we have this tension of doing things that are important for our individual career and maintaining the criteria that are set by our academic structure. And that can be at odds with what's really important and beneficial for the science moving forward. So I would love to talk for hours about that, but I'm going to move on in my last few minutes and just start to tie things together where, I think, what I'm advocating for, this sort of Moneyball analogy, is really to say, how can we continue to to make explicit what often is either implicit or just sort of hidden from our sort of understanding. Some years back, our NCI director had brought together leaders in oncology, in technology, and so forth. It said, let's solve this team science problem. Let's talk about it. Come, help us understand what it is that you do that makes it successful from a team science perspective. Don't talk about money and don't talk about, your science. And it was really hard for them. They all came and they talked about money and they talked about science and said, we need more flexibility to do what we do. But they really couldn't metacognate on what it is that sort of made them so successful. And so we need to continue to make that more explicit, and then think about how we're going to incorporate those into our training. In some cases, we may need some explicit curriculum and training around team science, and in other ways, we can be incorporating it. I have, when my children were in elementary school, they had, on their report card, math, reading, and collaboration. Hopefully that's going to be the case where those skills are sort of integral to their way of doing work, and maybe they'll be sort of imperceptible again because they'll be so sort of fluid in using them. And obviously we need to align our rewards and recognition. In my last minute, I will just highlight the fact that there are an emerging set of tools that you can draw on. The example on the upper left, the Coalesce, that's an online set of training modules around team science that Northwestern University has put out, and that's, I believe, really available. The collaboration plan document or infographic there is, I have that included in a chapter that's freely available. I can share that with the organizers, or you can email me. That's from this book that I'll highlight in just one second, and lots of other tools. And just to end with a resource that touches on a whole array of the issues that were brought up by myself and others throughout the day. These, how to work in integrative science teams, expanding engagement, working with clinicians, patients, and so forth. And so this is available, and certainly email me if you have questions, and perhaps we have 1 minute for a question.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was a great talk. I want to again take a pause and see if anyone has any questions from the audience. And again, please type that into the Q&A box. I would also point out that you can feel free to type those questions in the Q&A box during the talk so we can accrue them. And again, not seeing any. Kara, let me ask you a question. You showed some interesting data, pointed to the benefits of team science approaches in terms of startup time, scientific productivity from a variety of different dimensions from your analyses. And one would assume that those track well with the institutional drivers that inform tenure and promotion criteria. Yet we haven't seen a tremendous amount of change in a lot of those tenure and promotion criteria in institutions. So I was just curious if you would like to hypothesize why the gap, why the gap when data shows the benefit of these team science approaches, which aligns with our institutional missions. Why aren't we making those changes? And again, this is more asking you to editorialize.
Yeah, I mean, I remember speaking at the National Academy some years back and suggesting, some of these changes, and there was like gasps in the audience by administrators. And, I think that we, our tenure system, it has, is so ingrained in the way in which people are conceptualizing what's important and what's valued. And I think it's been really hard for, many of the people who are in the leadership, the primary leadership positions, you really have grown up with a system that's different. And so I think there's still this need to really understand what, how things can change and what things can change. And, doing this analysis of several hundred tenure and promotion policies, there's clearly efforts that people are trying to make, to tweak what's happening and to account for the fact that, there's differences across disciplines and departments in these cultures. And I think that's another thing that's challenging, that, each discipline has its way of dealing with things. When we look at physicists like those who are working in the CERN Hadron Collider, they have a whole, shadow system of publications to deal with, some of the issues of credit and so forth for junior faculty that they've sort of created in order to give the kind of credit that's needed. Yet there's other issues and challenges that they have in their sort of team science paradigm. So it's a slow moving process.
I think you just described a self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent. So I really appreciate a great talk. I will point out I'm excited. There's a question for you, Kara, in the Q&A, which allows me to believe that the Q&A is working, which is good news. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on, but perhaps you could type an answer for that